welcome to ET Markets Crypto TV presented by CoinSwitch Kuber. On this show, we demystify crypto and its universe. Today, our focus, smart contracts. What do they do? What are they? And how do they or how will they impact all of us? And what are the regulatory challenges? I'm pleased to welcome John deVadoss, board member of the Global Blockchain Business Council, a Switzerland-based nonprofit aimed at furthering adoption of blockchain by engaging regulators, business leaders to make it more equal. John is also the founder and president of ngdenterprise, where he builds blockchain developer tools. Previously, he was a general manager at Microsoft, where he built and led the .NET architecture, and he built Microsoft Digital from zero to $500 million of business worldwide. John, welcome, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for the very kind intro. You're very generous, and thank you again for making time for me, Milani. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for making time for us, John. John, we'd like you to demystify smart contracts for us. So can you start by telling us what are smart contracts and what do they exactly do?
Yes, definitely. And so, but if I could just step back for maybe a couple of minutes, just to set some context, and then we can delve in very deep into the topic of smart contracts. I want to highlight two things, if I may. Firstly, this notion of centralization versus decentralization. And I want to just emphasize, it's not a binary 0 or 1, i.e., something is centralized or something is decentralized. The idea behind decentralization is, to me, very simply put, there is more than one entity. Ideally, you want to have as many as possible. And I think for me personally, until and unless every individual, every human being has a role to play, we really can't say something is decentralized, right? That to me is really how I think about centralization versus decentralization. And so I want to just make this point up front. There are many people out in the industry who will say that, we are X, Y, decentralized and so on. And frankly, for me, it's just a spectrum, right? The second thing I want to say, building on this notion of unless every individual, every human being has a role to play, you are not really decentralized. The second thing is around policy, especially at this time. There is a significant amount of time and energy and focus on the topic of policy and regulations. And I want to give you a perspective. This space of blockchain technologies and certainly around crypto economics and cryptocurrencies, I see it really as providing options, providing alternatives for individuals across the globe. And I don't see it as an either or with respect to this versus the other. The challenge, however, as we all know, is policy and regulators are always usually typically behind the curve. And the challenge is, how do you play this balancing act? Do you wait until policy is set in stone? Not always. You cannot, because policymakers cannot work in a vacuum. At the same time, on the flip side, do you push the envelope in terms of innovation? You got to be careful as well, because you go too fast, you pace yourself too quickly, and policymakers obviously have a significant challenge on their hands in terms of trying to grapple with the space. Yeah. So just want to set the context a little bit, if I could. So back to your question, Milani, in terms of what exactly are smart contracts. Put very simply, it's code that executes and runs on a distributed network or system. Could be a ledger, and certainly could be what we call a decentralized blockchain. But very simply, it's just code. And sometimes, I wish that we hadn't called it a contract, because the term contract has many connotations, right? Too many connotations, in fact. And of course, the word smart itself also has connotations. But here we are stuck with the term, but think of it as computer code that runs on a distributed system.
Can you give us an example where this computer code runs on a distributed system? So where are these smart contracts being used?
That's a very good question. Absolutely. So by and large, these blockchain networks operate on assets, and assets could obviously, be economic assets, could be, real estate, could be property, could be obviously, today we talk about digital assets and like things like NFTs and so on, right? So typically, the most common scenario, the most common use cases for smart contracts are to operate on assets. And so what does it mean to operate? It could be to create a new asset. It could be, what they term burn, or to destroy an asset. It could be to transfer an asset from one entity to another entity. It could be to be able to fractionalize, to divide up an asset into perhaps smaller pieces. So any and all operations on assets. And of course, sometimes you hear the word token. And for me, the term token is really another term for an asset. So think of smart contract as code, operating on assets. Now, again, in very practical terms, assets can also be goods, in terms of a supply chain or on a logistics pipeline. And that also you're operating on assets, on goods. And what you might be doing is you might be tracking the flow of a good or an asset across, multiple shipping ports, as a very simple example, right? Or you could be tracking, for example, foodstuffs, vegetables, as they traverse again through a supply chain across various, intermediate points, right? So very simple examples, but like I said, at the abstract level, I would say think of a smart contract as code that is operating on an asset.
Are there standards for smart contracts?
That's a wonderful question. I'm really glad you asked me the question. Yes, and in fact, about a year and a half ago, I was one of the co-founders of what is called the Interwork Alliance, and the Interwork Alliance eventually merged with the Global Blockchain Business Council, and that's what led to me being on the board of the GBBC. So what we have done is to create standards for the schemas and for the protocols. We have seen this before, obviously, right? We've seen this in terms of consumer and enterprise technologies. There's always a tipping point wherein consumers, will adopt these emerging technologies only when you have standards, and in particular, standards for interoperability, right? To be able to move across, blockchains or platforms, to be able to work across blockchains or platforms. So what we have done, I'll give you a simple example, is, for example, what is called the TTF. The TTF is the token taxonomy framework. And think of it as both an ontology as well as a taxonomy to be able to define, to create, to instantiate, and then to interoperate tokens or assets across multiple platforms. So we have schemas that you can use to say, okay, this is a fungible, divisible, fractionable, etc. Or you could say, this is a non-fungible, transferable. For example, think of a diploma or a certificate. It's a kind of a token. It's an asset. I go to college for 4 years, I get a diploma. It's an asset that I have for me. So to be able to work with these diplomas across multiple universities, across multiple institutions, so that you can have, accreditation, for example, you want to have a schema that defines the diploma. And that's something you could do with the token taxonomy framework. And we expect, of course, much bigger, another example is in terms of bonds, debt assets, right? So being able to define bonds in, again, standards-based schema gives us the possibility of having multiple banking entities and regulators be able to come together to define, right? To be able to regulate. And of course, at the end of the day, to have consumers participate consumers and corporations participate in these bond offerings, as an example.
And John, whoever then gets into smart contracts, they follow these standards. Are they binding?
That's a really good question as well. Are they binding? So multiple perspectives. So firstly, as a software guy, as a geek, is it binding in terms of the code? Yes, because the schemas enforce that binding in terms of the execution of the code on the schema. So when you define a schema for, again, let's say a debt offering, a bond, right? Yes, it is absolutely binding. Now, of course, from another perspective, you look at it in terms of regulators and policy. And is it binding? That is still an area of progress, Melanie. So we obviously, in certain jurisdictions, we have policies and regulations that are much more significantly mature. In other jurisdictions, we have I would say perhaps politely, a lot less mature in terms of policy and regulation. So it varies. Now, with that said, this kind of movie is something we have seen in previous waves of technologies. For instance, cloud platforms. About 15 years ago, cloud platforms, you had proprietary stacks from the likes of Microsoft. In fact, I built, the first version of Azure back. It was called Red Dog at that time. That was the code name before it was called Azure, right? And so back 14, 15 years ago, there weren't really standards or specifications for interoperability and portability. But since then, we've come a long way across the likes of Microsoft, Google Cloud, Amazon Web Services, and so on, because customers demand that level of interop, portability, and so on, right? So we see a very similar movie playing here. The early adopters, the innovators are pushing the envelope, and eventually, policymakers catch up. And if you ask me, if I were a betting man, I would say we are probably about 24 months away from a significant groundswell in terms of policy, in terms of compliance, and of course, to use the word you said, which I like, making it binding.
Why should I trust a smart contract?
That's a really good question as well. No, it's a very good question. Absolutely. I think it's a totally fair question to ask, how do we trust and why should we trust? So again, I'll give you multiple perspectives. So why should we trust it? Because obviously it is code, and once code is signed, and when I say signed, cryptographically signed, you have mathematical proof that the code has not been tampered. The code will not be tampered, right? So what you see is what you get in terms of the definition of the code, i.e. the smart contract, as well as the execution of the smart contract. However, there's also, I guess you could say, the layman's perspective. Why should I trust it? Especially when you're working with assets. And this is where, topics like governance and compliance come into play. And also, I would say in terms of insurance, in terms of being able to insure against liability. So let me parse those two aspects. So in terms of compliance, in terms of governance, we obviously have the ability to have multiple layers of smart contracts. You have the underlying layer, which is, like you said, do I trust this contract, which is working on my assets, which could be, perhaps an apartment that I am a part owner of, right? But then on top of it, you overlay another layer of smart contracts, enforces the compliance and the governance capabilities as an overlay. And of course, the people who write the underlying smart contracts are not the same people as those who write the compliance and the governance code. Furthermore, the people who inspect and verify are also different. In the first case, you have the actual operators, you have the people who are selling or buying, for example, this particular apartment. At the second level, you have a different set of operators. You have, again, perhaps regulators, governments, quasi public sector organizations, and so on. The last piece, like I said, which is interesting, which is an emerging domain, is also when you say, should I trust? Why should I trust? And how do I ensure that if something goes wrong, I have the ability, to be compensated, or I have some recourse. And this is where we are seeing a very interesting, I would say almost fascinating evolution in terms of claims, in terms of insurance, right? Being able to have the ability to address any loss. And also not just the loss, but also possibly, you could say, in addition to the loss, or the potential loss, I should be careful to say, beyond the potential loss, to also have compensation beyond perhaps even the value of the asset. And again, it's a very early space, it's emerging, but I certainly believe we're going to see significant innovation, and we're going to see the big participants, obviously, the financial sector in a very big way, the insurance sector in a very big way, because as we said earlier, in a world where we are becoming less and less centralized, we need this ability to address, to ensure, right? To ensure, to have the claims and the compensation. But again, are we there yet? Not yet, but we will get there slowly but surely.
John, what you said, I'm thinking, if I get into a regular contract, there is a possibility of me adding clauses. Is there a functionality within a smart contract to do that, or do you have to do everything from zero again?
So another wonderful question. I'm really happy to see you have these questions. Very well asked. In the world of assets and contracts operating on assets, I believe, and this is sort of my driving principle as we work with the token taxonomy framework, the Interwork Alliance, the GBBC, and more, is that code once written and once governed by obviously policy and regulatory agencies should not be changed. So you have a version 1 of a smart contract, and subsequently, if you want to make changes, and sometimes we will make those changes. It could be an addendum, could be a clarification, it could also be about fixing perhaps, let's call it a bug that was unintentionally, introduced. So the way we should go about doing this is to retire the version 1 of the smart contract, and then to introduce a version 2 of the smart contract, and then go off and instantiate this. And this way, you have very clear separation. You have also the ability to manage the change without being, how do you say it, loosey-goosey about what happened in the first instance, and then not having the traceability or the log of if, were there any changes made? If so, why? And when exactly, right? So this is why I believe that there has to be very clear versioning and very crisp ability to track the change log, if you will. So we know version 1 was this, and if that was the final version, great. But if we had a V2 and a version 2.1, we know very clearly we can trace it back, and we can apply like I said, the change log with respect to the implementation of the code, as well as the compliance and the policy aspects on top of it.
Right. John, I want to link to what you said right up, and you put a caveat in place. You said that it cannot be decentralized unless everyone is a part of it. So my question comes from there. When do you see the widespread adoption of smart contracts? Because public education or understanding around blockchain, crypto, is lacking. And would you say that the learning curve is very steep? See, because smart contract will require the transformation of many roles. Lawyers may have to learn how to possibly write code. Judges must learn how to interpret it. So I think there is a way to go.
No, so I guess, again, a wonderful question. So I'll tell you something we have been doing with the Interwork Alliance and the GBBC, which is to have what you might call much more domain-friendly ways to define the schemas and the smart contracts. So typically, and you could say thus far in history, right? Thus far in history, you look at the major platforms, ledgers, and blockchains. You've had to, in fact, I would say, you've been forced to use what you might call classical computer languages, whether it be a C# or a Go or a Python or whatever, right? And that suffices very well for the geeks who build the infrastructure. But as you said, and as we discussed earlier, to truly have decentralization in the real sense of the world, we will have to have individuals, all of us, be able to participate. And this means that we need domain-friendly languages, perhaps business-friendly, or as you said, Milani, very well, legal-friendly, languages, which are much easily readable and certainly much more easily changeable, right, by lawyers, attorneys, by policymakers, and even by consumers. A consumer who's looking to obviously participate, let's say, in pooling a group of people to acquire a property. So what we have done is, we have the underlying schemas themselves. The schemas define the asset or the token. Then we have the code, the smart contract, and we are building essentially domain-specific tools where visually, for example, right, visually, an attorney or a lawyer is able to define, to make the changes and say, this is the flow. These are the logical steps. These are the transactions. And then we can translate from these domain-specific languages. I don't want to call them a language, but think of it as a domain-specific abstraction, a visual abstraction. And then we go from those to eventually, a C# or a Python or a Go. And what this also gives you is the traceability of the smart contract as designed, as defined by, say, an attorney or a commercial, lawyer, or a real estate, perhaps, developer, right? And then we can go. And this is going to be the way that by domain, we look at insurance, we look at real estate, we look at, bonds, you look at, any of these domains. This is the way we will make this mainstream. Otherwise, to have to assume or expect that, everybody will have to use a computer language is a no-go.
Right, exactly. Chauncey, smart contracts are not limited by geographies. Users can be from different countries. So in such a scenario, which laws will apply to smart contracts, agreements, transactions, cases?
Yes, that's a really good question. So I'll give you sort of two perspectives. One is the domain itself. For example, if we look at, let's say, trade finance, right? Trade finance is a very well-defined domain in terms of the activities, the business processes, the use cases, the scenarios. And trade finance obviously has multiple, bodies of policymakers, regulators that define very clearly, what are the expectations, what are the responsibilities, what are, and so on and so forth. So we have that perspective and that set of, you might say, rules and constraints, and of course the enforcement, right? The enforcement, and then by enforcement, the penalties, as the case may be with respect to non-compliance. But then, as you said, there is also the geographical jurisdiction of, nation states, and of course, entities like the EU or the US and so on. And this is where, unfortunately, we are not there as an industry yet. Why is this? It's obviously because, much like, to use a very, I guess, politically incorrect analogy, water flows from a high point to a low point. And at this point, as we all know, multiple jurisdictions have different, value in terms of this emerging stack and the new set of technologies. And unfortunately, as water flows, certain aspects of the industry, they are naturally flowing to jurisdictions where perhaps there is much more lax enforcement, or even, where there is really no existing, regulations or policies, which, by the way, is not healthy. Because you can't grow and mature an industry that way. The way you mature and grow and scale to create value to the citizens of the planet as a whole is by ensuring there's a level playing field. And unfortunately, again, I'm not speaking for any organization, but just speaking for myself, You look at the G20, as an entity, right? Do we have consistency? Unfortunately, we don't, right? We look at even the EU, for example. I believe in Q1 of next year, we're going to see some clarity across the European Union. But today, even within the EU, we look at multiple entities, and oftentimes, shall I say it politically incorrectly, you can do policy arbitrage, right? Which is a really unfortunate way of thinking about it, but that's the reality. And any time, any era where players can do policy arbitrage is, to me, a very extremely unhealthy time. But unfortunately, that's where we are, and we will have to come through this where we can eliminate this kind of policy arbitrage and ensure a level playing field in a domain like trade finance, in a domain obviously like bonds and so on.
John, from everything you've said, does it really mean that for this to get entrenched and to take off, really, we will need, a wide-scale agreement, and that is maybe worldwide agreement in terms of policy? And as you yourself have just pointed out, that is very difficult to manage. If that is the case, how will this take off?
Again, it's a wonderful question. It's in some sense, I guess, to say it politically incorrectly, a chicken and an egg game in some sense, right? So, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Frankly, to expect that we will have this ideal state across, a large number of jurisdictions, 190 countries, I believe is unrealistic. And of course, in no other domain do we have that level of concordance, right? To be very frank. So that's going to be an unrealistic expectation. However, we see. You look at finance, for example, right? You look at SWIFT. You look at being able to simply being able to do transfers, remittances, to be able to. So we clearly have the infrastructure, and we have the compliance and the governance capabilities on top of the underlying infrastructure. We are able to, as consumers, individuals, and as entities, corporate and public sector, to be able to operate, across the globe. We know a company can have offices in Mumbai, in Sri Lanka, in Brazil, in London, right? And we're able to obviously, build significant value. The same way is how I look at this one, which is, for the value creation to happen, jurisdictions will see the benefit, and they will see obviously across in terms of tax base, with respect to employment, with respect to innovation, and not being, leapfrogged by perhaps other entities. But to your question, the short answer is, will it happen at scale across? No, I don't think so. And I think it would be unrealistic. However, if we can get key players, and of course, you have the US, you have India, get key players to be able to step up and take a position, I believe then you will have the remaining countries kind of, step behind in line and align with respect to, what will be set in place by the key players.
You see smart contracts impacting more than in others, them taking the first steps rather?
Yeah, so and we can look back and we can look forward. So when we look back, what we have seen is primarily, like I said, in terms of assets. We have seen, obviously, real estate has been a space where we're able to securitize real estate properties as both investments, but also as debt instruments. In the commercial space, we've been able to tokenize, like we said, trade finance in a very significant way. We're able to, if you look at carbon markets, right, being able to tokenize carbon markets to have an, I think at this point, we would all agree that obviously, energy, ESG is a significant priority. And people have talked about carbon markets and offsets for a very long time. But being able to tokenize these offsets and have carbon markets that can interoperate across multiple jurisdictions is happening finally. And of course, if you look at cryptocurrencies themselves, you could say they're also tokens, assets in their own right. You have stable coins. But looking forward, I think where we are seeing the most innovation and certainly the most if you could use the word disruption, it's a much abused word, right? But if you could talk about disruption, I think it's going to be in the world of virtual assets and virtual tokens. NFTs are obviously one category. We talk about this notion of a metaverse, right? What does it mean? I don't think we know quite clearly, but we have an idea of where we are going. So I believe, looking forward, that's going to be the space where we will see an explosion, a true explosion of innovation. The challenge is going to be, how do we harness this? And especially, how do we balance sort of the today and the tomorrow in a constructive way that we don't leave people behind, or we don't leave people kind of, stuck in the new without having a good grasp of balancing both, right? Neither one is good or bad, but the challenge is going to be, how do we sort of build the bridge? And that's kind of something I think a lot about, because I think the young people are going to be really into this theme of the metaverse. And, I own assets in the digital world, I own property, and so on and so forth. And looking from an economic perspective, especially where we are as a planet with inflation, and of course, we can talk about economics for a long time, but I think young people see the opportunity to own virtual assets as a much more feasible way than to own real assets, right? Which is a tragedy in some ways. A reflection, I would say, of the failure of macroeconomics, but we have to find a way to ensure that tomorrow's generation is still able to have a, 1 foot in the new and 1 foot in the old. Otherwise, there's going to be a divide, which
John, India is going through this whole, the government is mulling and has said it's coming out with regulation. We don't know what it will be, but I think one thing is very clear. They've said that they do not want, they will look at cryptocurrencies as asset and not as currency. What, if you can answer this question, if it is within your, if you'd like to answer, we'd like to understand from your vantage, how do you see this as impacting what you spoke about, the innovation, and the point that you made of not leaving anyone behind?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'll give you my opinion. I want to just be very careful. It's my personal opinion. It doesn't reflect any organization that I'm a part of. So speaking personally in terms of the second point you raised is the critical one, which is the longer we keep this gray area, this lack of clarity, I think the greater the risk of this divide with respect to people, who look at tomorrow as the only, and people who say, look, how do we ensure this balance, this blend, right? So from that perspective, I certainly wish, and I hope that policymakers will be able to quickly provide clarity so that people can actually get on with their lives, right? Get on with their assets and get on with their financial, plans and models. With respect to your first question, yes, we could think of cryptocurrencies as obviously currencies, which I believe is not the direction that's going to go, especially from an India perspective. Totally understandable. We could think of them as commodities, another perfectly fine perspective, right? We could think of them as securities, possibly, another totally fine perspective. But of course, the challenge is going to be that each of these lenses entails different policymakers and different bodies of regulators. And that clarity is going to be critical. Otherwise, not only are you going to have confusion in terms of the consumer, but I think you run the risk of confusion on the part of the regulator, which is worse, right? Because then when you have regulators, essentially a tug of war of who has, policy-making ability, then you end up in a really worse off place. Of course, in the middle of this, there is the potential always that, you lose talented people. People might choose to say, look, I'll go to a jurisdiction where there is clarity, or at least more clarity than where they might get. And that is something I think no nation wants to be, to have to face that, because obviously, every country's greatest asset, is people, especially young people, talented people who want to build, who want to create. So from that perspective, I certainly would wish, just to have a prescriptive mechanism, which can evolve, right? A prescriptive framework, because it's not going to be done. There is not going to be a perfect model. It cannot be, because there's so much innovation happening. But having a prescriptive framework with the ability to evolve, right? Not to drastically drop and then recreate. No, that will be a fundamental failure, I think. But the framework that you can kind of gradually, incrementally evolve would be, for me, the ideal path forward. But of course, we shall see. I suppose we will know very soon.
Yes, we shall know very soon. And, a lot of people who are, within the crypto ecosystem in India are also waiting. And hopefully we'll have clarity, as you say. But John, it's been wonderful speaking to you. Thank you so much for putting your lens on smart contracts and helping us understand and demystifying it a little bit for us. We still have a long way to go when it comes to learning about all of these, all these little things that make up the ecosystem, the blockchain ecosystem. But thank you very much for your time and for your expertise today.
Thank you very much.